So, Leathermen, the iconic masculine symbols of the LGBTQ+ community. For as long as there's been gay bars, there's been Leathermen. And also dark rooms. And then also Leathermen in those dark rooms. But in the last few years, the leather community has been on a decline, especially in comparison to the rubber and pup communities, which have been on the rise over the past 10 to 15 years or so. This is really interesting to me because Leathermen, and specifically leather daddies and drag queens, represent two of the most fundamental aspects of our community. So while drag is changing, it's for sure not on a decline. In fact, the opposite is happening. So why can't the same be said about our other icon? Before I go further in this video, I have to say, there is no way I can make the entire leather community happy with this video. Least of all with me. I fully expect to be called an arrogant but also sexy and iconic twink. And that's just not true. I'm not a twink. So if you are on the leather scene, regardless of whether it's the lesbian scene, the gay scene, whatever your story is, please share your story down below. I want to hear it. That's what the comment section is there for. And so you can understand me and where I'm coming from. Here is my story. So a few years ago, when I first started to take fetish seriously, it didn't take long for me to get a handler. And he's asked not to be named in this video, but at the time, he was a Mr. Leather title holder. Actually, he's been on the scene for about the same amount of time that I've been alive. Listen, I'm baby who like daddy. My training as a sub under him is what would be considered old school. We eventually went our separate ways. There was a multitude of reasons for this, but a big one was the fact that at the time, this YouTube channel was signed to the Disney Digital Network. And because of that, I couldn't commit myself to him or fetish seriously. And while that was the case, neither of us were sad about it, and we still talk off and on to this day. It wasn't until the summer of 2020, in that brief period before the second wave of COVID came, where I was in Berlin and I got to try on a full leather uniform for the first time. And my reaction was, oh no, here's another expensive fetish. See, I'd been licking the boots of Leathermen for several years at that point, but I'd never actually been in a leather uniform while licking the boots, and it turns out a combination does a lot for me. So much. And so when I first conceived of this video on Patreon, I knew I wanted to be in full leather for this video. So Mr. RIEGILLIO were actually kind enough to supply all of the leather outfits I will be wearing in this video. And then this year I moved to Chicago and I got in touch with the leather community here. And my respect for the leather community grew, as did my fetish. Now I love leather as much as I love rubber, which is great. Not for my bank account though, that hates me. Patreon down below. So in this video, I want to explore the history of Leathermen and explore the concept of why Leathermen are a fundamental part of the soul of the LGBTQ+ community, as well as some of the philosophies surrounding the Leathermen community, all while resisting getting on the floor licking a pair of boots. And also, before we enter the first chapter of this video, I do want to give a shout out to the Leather Archives and Museum who've been kind enough to let me film here for free. If you're in Chicago, please come and check out the Leather Archives and Museum. The people that run it are fantastic. There is some seriously sexy artwork behind me. Please come and check this place out. It is a fundamental part of our community, and there are so many people that are on the scene that have never been here, and it's great. Please come and check it out. Chapter 1. Why leather? So I'm pretty open about being into fetish, even with the few vanilla friends I have. And the thing is, they can understand my rubber fetish quite easily. Rubber's skin tight, it shows off the body, but they never seem to be able to quite wrap their heads around leather. And you know what? I don't necessarily disagree with them. If you're just looking at the material, it doesn't make much sense. So rubber doesn't necessarily come with any pre-existing dynamics. You kind of have to make that yourself. Leather supposedly does. I say it in that way very intentionally. But I think what they're actually asking is, where did this community come from, and why did the gay men of the past settle on leather, specifically leather styled in military uniforms to represent them? Well, this all goes back to a little event in history I like to call Please Stop the Mass Murdering Fuckhead with Too Much Power, more commonly known as World War II. And not Russia-Ukraine 2022. So while men from all over the world were drafted to go to war during World War II, we're specifically looking at American men in this context of history. So these men were sent to Europe to fight in World War II, and while surrounded by other men at war, they realized, oh shit, I love sucking dick and cock. Now keep in mind, a lot of gay men during this time period didn't even know that being gay was an option. It wasn't that it was discriminated against, it's that they didn't even know it existed. And the few men that did know that being gay existed often conflated it with pedophilia. So after World War, men went back home and quite a lot of them were like, I can't go back to living how I was before. So by the 1960s, LGBTQ+ motorcycle clubs had started to pop up all over the United States. And in 1953, the Satyrs were founded. These guys, while being gay was still heavily illegal, traveled around fighting for LGBTQ+ rights. To this day, motorcycle clubs borrow from these guys' bylaws, and I actually think they may still be active even now. Now let's take a moment to pause on this little nugget of history. Let's break through the layers of what was going on with these men at war, discovering they were being gay, sucking dick and cock. So we have a discovery of sexuality within a society that probably, almost definitely, did not accept that sexuality, coupled with probable PTSD. I don't know if you've heard, but going to war tends to be pretty hard on the human psyche. When you take things from this perspective, you can see how these motorcycle clubs formed almost out of necessity. For a lot of these men, they couldn't come out to their families, so they had to create new families where they could be surrounded by people that understood both their sexuality and their trauma. And this same trend spread out of the United States, and the world's first official leather bar opened right here in Chicago. It was the Gold Coast, and it was opened by Chuck Renslow and the artist Etienne. And the two of them also opened up the Leather Archives, the very building I'm standing in. So what I just said about the Gold Coast, it's more a claim than it is a fact. Leather bars have existed for a very, very long time, but the gay aspect would have been hidden originally, so we don't know which gay leather bar was the first one. In all honesty, it was probably sometime before 1958. It's not like sucking dick and cock and discussing the mouthfeel was a newfangled idea by that point. Basically, wearing leather while sucking dick at a place where you can also have a drink is a bit of an old concept, and we do well to remember that. The Gold Coast was just run by the right people in the right time at the right place where it had the ability to make this claim. All of this raises the question, where is the connection between motorcycles and BDSM? Because let's be honest, it seems like a really random jump. Most of us aren't attracted to motorcycles. Most of us. But in the scene, leather is almost synonymous with domination and submission. So where does this come from? So there was a film released in 1953 called The Wild One, which played on society's fascination with this event called the Hollister Riot. After World War II, motorcycle clubs popped up all over the US, gay, straight, you name it. And this was the birth of leather culture in the broader sense. Not everyone connected it to sex or sexuality. In 1947, the American Motorcyclist Association sanctioned a rally in Hollister, California, and way more people turned up than expected, and the locals hated it. So this event became known as the Hollister Riot. So then in The Wild One, there's a character called Johnny Strapper, and his visual style and attitude is almost identical to the people that appeared at the Hollister Riot, or at least what the normies considered the people's attitude to be. He became a cultural icon, and he was associated with a dissatisfaction with mainstream culture. Basically, he was a pushback against hierarchy itself. Gay men began to imitate this style because it was inherently associated with masculinity. And I very intentionally say gay men and not just bikers. So by this point, the gay panic seed had blossomed into a rainbow tree of hysteria. The idea that gay men were inherently feminine was on the rise, so gay men wanted to recapture masculinity. So they did that by imitating this style, but just making it associated with gay men. It was masculinity, but in a way that was never going to be accepted by mainstream culture. And if I'm going to give anything to the world of philosophy, this is a concept I would like to call a queering. It is where a queer human takes a concept that they would be traditionally shut out from and recreates it in a queer image that would never be accepted by mainstream culture. This style was undeniably masculine to everyone, but did not fit the tastes of 1950s mainstream society. It's also during the 1950s that we got the birth of male physique magazines, which were basically literature for gay men before being gay was legal. So the motorcycle scene did actually come with bylaws, hierarchy, and regulations. This was something that men that dressed in the style would have been aware of, and all of that feeds into BDSM. And you have to keep in mind, a lot of the men that were involved with motorcycle clubs were ex-military, so they had this inherent need for hierarchy in their life. And all of these are things that naturally fit into BDSM style thinking. On top of that, a bar having a theme wasn't against the law. You know, leather is a really good theme and it was a very good cover. But you know which theme would have been heavily illegal?
Sucking dick and cock.
So having a theme as a front for a gay bar was the perfect cover. Especially when, and I really want to stress, it wasn't just bikers dressing in this style. It was gay men as a whole. This really served as a form of protection because the crowd that these bars attracted on the surface seemed so incredibly rough that no one would dare step foot inside unless they really knew what was going on. This served as a fantastic way to keep the police away and allow for growth and experimentation, which in turn allowed for the growth of BDSM. It wasn't perfect, there were police raids, in some places more than others. In fact, to paraphrase a quote from Chuck Renslow's biography, people used to say, if you don't want to stand in the police bus, stand towards the front of the bar. But then after homosexuality was legalized, leather bars started operating in a bit more of an above ground kind of way. But what's interesting is they haven't really changed to this day. In the book The Leatherman's Handbook by Larry Townsend, he describes the old cinema, which was on Santa Monica Boulevard. The interior was about 24 by 30 feet. The walls were black and blotchy, decorated with many posters, pictures, road signs, almost any object which took the fancy of the management, employees, or customers. The crowd wore a wonderful mixture of leather, Levi jackets, and scroungy bottom-fly jeans. Most leather bars tend to draw most heavily from the over 35s. So I had a descriptor of a back bar and then TV screens playing various adult films, and you have both Cell Block and Touche here in Chicago. But this book was written in 1972, and I'm reading from the revised version, which was published in the year 2000. But to my knowledge, that quote is the exact same in the original version. So that means these bars, aside from a few touches of modern conveniences, have aesthetically stayed the same for the past 50 years minimum. So what's funny to me, in a foreword just a few pages later, written by Jack Fritcher, a leather bar is described as black paint plus red light bulb equals leather bar, which again is a little bit too accurate. Thanks, Jack. The other interesting thing to me is his point about attracting over 35s. The rubber and pub scenes tend to attract people in my age group, and even some people older. But every time I go to a leather event, I'm basically one of the youngest ones there. And I'm distinctly younger than 35, which is interesting to me, but so we don't get derailed, I want to put a pin in this for now, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm sexy baby. Pin doesn't seem very on topic. I want to tie it down for now. Yeah, tie it down, that's hotter. We'll come back to this later. So now we know where leather comes from, we can start to discuss something called Chapter 2, Old Guard. Is it real? No. No, it is not. Also, yes it is. Roll the credits. Okay, so let's elaborate. There are some practices that do come under what people refer to as old guard. Boot blacking, for example, is one of them. But that's not what we're talking about here. So for as long as there's been a leather scene, there's been people mentioning old guard, but what do people mean when they say old guard? This has always been very interesting to me. So a few friends and I went out for cigars a few months ago here in Chicago. Pause. What in the actual fucking middle class have I become? Did I just... Anyway, the topic of old guard came up, and one friend said how one day we would be considered old guard. My other friend, however, pointed out that old guard isn't actually a time period and we would never actually be old guard. And the conversation just kind of stagnated there, and we went inside. And listen, it was minus 16 degrees outside. The fact that we could hold a conversation was a fucking achievement. So I took these two perspectives and started to do my own research, both in reading correspondences from people on the scene and talking to my older friends from the scene. And I've sort of come to the conclusion that old guard can be boiled down to two distinct definitions. So the first is a time period and how practices were defined by this time period. You can actually divide this into a distinct beginning, middle, and end. So the beginning is the post-World War II era. We actually spoke about this in the previous chapter of this video. It's the formation of motorcycle clubs, the gay leather scene as a whole, and a lot of gay men experimenting with BDSM for the first time. And because this is a philosophy video, I should point out, it's thanks to this time period that we got Foucault. Foucault, if you don't know, is a very important philosopher, and he was also a leather man. He was actually one of Etienne and Tom of Finland's contemporaries, but I won't linger on this point for too long because this video already has one too many pretentious European scholars. But aside from the practices, the philosophies, and the artwork of this time period, I do think the clear defining factor of this time period and the attitude around it is an objective disdain for anything and everything feminine in relation to gay men. So there's this article from Life magazine in 1964, where a journalist pays the Toolbox in San Francisco a visit. Now this article was your typical dangers of homosexuality, everyone be afraid article. It points out that in the Toolbox, there was this hanging cluster of sneakers or tennis shoes. This hanging cluster of sneakers was there to represent effeminate gay men because those shoes were typically worn at the time by effeminate gay men. And if you were too feminine, you had no place at that bar. And obviously being comfortable is a very feminine thing. From what I've been able to pick up, this wasn't an uncommon attitude, and in many ways is still not. By 1969, when the Stonewall riots hit, that attitude seems to have faded out of necessity. We couldn't be going around hating each other in our community because we were all we had. Many Leathermen and members of motorcycle clubs actually started leading liberation marches across the entirety of the United States, and this included the Dykes on Bikes, who to this day are a staple at pride parades across the country. I won't linger on this point for too long because honestly it's its own topic, and will be its own topic in July this year. If it wasn't for the efforts of biker clubs and the leather community, we would not have Pride as we know it. And it's for that reason I am an avid supporter of fetish and the leather community being at Pride. And remember, there is nuance. Etienne was a well-trained ballet dancer and had a very successful career in that field. It was seen as an effeminate thing. But then we go to the end of this time period, and there are two distinct points that we could call the ending, and both of them completely changed how our community works. The first point is the beginning of the HIV crisis. This community, the leather community, was formed with the idea of exploring one's sexuality in a very physical way. And because of that, HIV spread like wildfire. We lost some amazing minds and talents because of HIV. Etienne and Foucault, for example, both died because of complications due to AIDS. Worldwide, government's attitude in the beginning of the HIV crisis was this was a punishment from God before homosexuality. But then it started to affect straight people, so gay people became lab rats for possible cures to HIV. Obviously, gay people were told not to distribute this possible cure to friends and family. They went against that because it was a possible cure. Their friends and family were dying. And when our community was told off for doing this, the gay people's response at this time was, we are not lab rats. We are people and we need help. Normally I'd insert a joke here to lighten the mood, but there isn't a joke that would be in good taste, so I'll leave this on some hope. These days, with proper treatment, HIV can become undetectable, which means it's untransmittable. On top of that, we also have PrEP, a medication that can protect you from HIV. Moreover, with the current pandemic giving us a much more solid understanding of how viruses work, there is renewed hope that one day we will have a vaccine for HIV. The other possible endpoint for what this idea of the old guard is the advent of the internet. My first exposure to Leathermen and actually talking to them was MySpace. Actually, my gay mum and dad were a couple of Leathermen that I met on MySpace when I was 11 years old. No, I was not old enough to have an account, but I will not tell Tom if you won't. Prior to the internet, the only way to really communicate with the leather community was through written letters, mailing lists, specialty magazines, and these secret events that you could only get invited to. With the internet giving a form of rapid communication, it changed the scene forever. And it just made it more accessible to all kinds of people. It also made purchasing leather easier than ever. And also, there were a lot of tutorials popping up for how to make your own leather. Basically, the access point for fetish was severely reduced. Regardless of where you place this endpoint, I don't think old guard is a particularly apt name for a time period. I would like to refer to this time period as the golden age of leather culture. We really saw the formation of the leather community. We saw them come together for pride parades and the HIV crisis. Leathermen just became a staple of the LGBTQ+ community. Basically, a really long-winded way of saying blame the internet. So what about the other definition, which is more in line with what I think the majority of people are saying when they refer to old guard? So before we go forward, I want to remind you that for as long as leather culture has existed, there have been people referring to old guard. From this, we can summarize that it's more an attitude than it is a time period. So typically, when people refer to this time period, they're referring to this weird combination of masculinity, hierarchy, and hard kink, which, on the surface, when done right, is harmless. In fact, when those three things are done together, it can be quite fun. But usually, when this is spoken about, it's spoken about in a way where people are saying there isn't enough of those things, which I just smile and nod at. And if you don't know, smiling and nodding is British for, what the fuck? There is this weird level of irony present in this definition. So gay men were ostracized from mainstream culture for not being masculine enough. So there was this queering of masculinity that we spoke about earlier, and then people got this idea that the more queer masculine you were, the higher on the hierarchy you were. This recreates a system of oppression that is near identical to the one they faced before, but this time, they're the ones in power. But the very existence of Leathermen was a pushback against hierarchy itself. The reason they chose to dress the way they dressed was because there was an objective disdain for the way society worked. Typically, I hear these complaints from people that believe that they should be higher up in the hierarchy, to which I just say, earn it. You're so fantastic. Really, I implore you, but I also want to stress, the hierarchy doesn't exist. So I have no idea what you're going to do. Personally, I view leather culture as something that really does bring into question the existence of hierarchy itself in the broadest sense. I'm a sub, pure sub. I just don't enjoy doming. I don't get much out of it. So when I do a scene, I choose one or more people to hand power to, and at the end of that scene, I take it back. It's not a 24/7 thing. So the hierarchy only exists for as long as I, the sub in this situation, choose to let it exist. If at any point I say no, we're done, the scene is over, and the truth is revealed, I'm the one with all the power in this scenario. The dom only has power over me for as long as I allow him to, which is typically on a weekday for 48 hours. Listen, I do like longer scenes, but I've got stuff to do. So let's expand that outside of leather to say governmental bodies. While it may appear on surface that governments have all the power, that only exists for as long as people agree to that. If people stopped allowing governments to have power over them, then said governments would cease to exist. So countries typically run in a way that make people forget that they're the ones with all the power, either through fear or patriotism. And to question the existence of your government is seen as an act of treason. So that's why leather is inherently connected to anarchy theory. Your life is different now. You are welcome. But it's this conditioning from governments that I suspect causes some men in the leather scene to believe that there is a hierarchy, because they believe there is one by default. Old guard is always going to come up in conversations. So when it does, ask the person that you're talking to specifically what they mean, because there is a world of difference between a time period, boot blacking, and a demand for hierarchy that never existed in the first place outside of individual relationships where people create it for 4 to 8 hours. And I will say, this is a strong minority of the scene, and the few times that I have heard old guard come up in person, I've been able to talk to this other human about their opinions over drinks, and typically end up with a friend at the end. It's also worth mentioning that when the term old guard first started to pop up, communication still wasn't that easy. So old guard traditions vary greatly from region to region, and I mean like city to city, not just country to country. So when you're talking to someone about this, it's worth asking them exactly what they mean. However, there are some instances where this old guard attitude is utilized in a practical and healthy way. So around the world, there are these leather clubs, and some are for new people on the scene. They're quite easy to join, but some are so exclusive, you need to be invited to multiple club events, and then you need to be nominated to join the club by multiple club members, and on top of that, you will have to pay dues, and some clubs even make sure that you actually pay your dues and you don't get someone else to pay for you. All of this is done to make sure you get along with the club itself, you're passionate about joining, and you actually care about being a member. There's actually a leather club here in Chicago that I heard about before I was even properly on the leather scene. So if you're part of that club, hi, my name's Duke. I'm on recon. What I enjoy about this attitude is that they take the concept from the old guard requirements, but alter them to fit their current membership. So rather than being, you're not masculine enough or you don't own enough leather, it's more, are you what our club looks for? And if you're not, you probably won't be invited to an event in the first place, so you're not gonna lose out. Moreover, if you do go to one of the events but you don't get along with the members outside of the person that invited you, you're not gonna want to join either. So it's really just an encouragement to be your fucking self and things will work out. And I should clarify, these clubs are not for people that are new to the scene. They're not for people that have a passing interest in kink. They're for like established members of the community. There are many public events that people can go to that are for everyone. I will be honest, outside of joking, I have no real distinct desire or passion to join a leather club at the moment, just because I haven't interacted with any enough to know the members. And I think that's the healthiest approach, because being a club is about being a part of a community. If I don't know the community, why would I want to join? I refuse to allow myself to build up any ideas of what these clubs are or what they're like or what the members are like, and I kind of think that's the healthiest approach. There's one that I am curious about, and because I'm curious about its legacy, but outside of that, I'm good. But with all of this talk of the past, what is our current age in leather? Where do we go next? Well, let's answer that with Chapter 3, Pageantry and Visibility. In the leather scene, we have a tendency to focus on the past a lot. We never really focus on the now or what's ahead of us. I describe our current age as pageantry for two reasons: online personas and literal leather competitions. So to explain this, I will now continue to talk about the past. Starting in 1970, there used to be a leather competition in Chicago called Mr. Gold Coast. Then in 1979, this became International Mr. Leather. The first competition had 12 men from 6 US states, but the last International Mr. Leather had 68 contestants from 26 US states and 15 countries. And you know what? It's a lot of numbers. I don't know if Mr. Gold Coast was the first competition or there were ones before it, but in order to compete in International Mr. Leather, you need to be a previous title holder or you need to be sponsored by a leather-related company, organization, or bar. So you need to be Mr. Leather Wales, Mr. Leather Eagle Manchester, Mr. Leather Doc Martens. Actually, can I be Mr. Leather Doc Martens? Leave a comment down below and let me know. But where did all of this come from and why have all of these contests to begin with? Let's start with the latter of these two questions because it, like myself, is easy. 2 feet and in bed. According to the book, The Leather Contest by Guy Baldwin, basically, the leather contest is the only way that we could systematically choose a leader for our group without giving into hierarchy. We've established that the leather scene is one that rejects the traditional notion of hierarchy, so it has to create its own system for the members to rally around. A contest winner is only that, a contest winner. They don't get further up the hierarchy, they chose to enter that contest. But at the same time, they do win a title, and with that title comes a certain level of responsibility. I'm actually friends with a previous national title holder, and he said being a title holder was the most rewarding, expensive, and depressing thing that he's ever done, and he would never do it again. So what are the responsibilities of a title holder? Well, they have a responsibility to their community, both new and old. For example, if you're new to the scene, you're going to your first event, and you're really nervous, find out who your local title holder is, send them a message, and normally they're the nicest people and it is their job to respond to you. In addition to that, some contests are held to attempt to raise money for charity. It can be down to national and other local title holders to show up to these contests to kind of like get the word out. It doesn't work because title holders are leaders. It works because title holders are typically people with a lot of friends. These people meet a lot of people in their year with their title. So their friends are going to turn up and support their friend, which in turn supports the charity. And then from what I've heard, title holders are expected to do research on every part of the leather and fetish world. And from what I have heard and experienced, most of them do not expect that. After your year of being a title holder, if you don't have enough knowledge on queer history, especially around the leather scene, to have a BA, you've done something wrong. It's really hard because you're traveling a lot of times out of your own pocket, and then on top of that, you have to do all of this research. And then on top of that, you still have your normal life, you still have your normal job. These guys may not earn much in terms of hierarchy, but they definitely earn the respect that they are given. So where do these contests come from? Please, the gays, start writing things down. It's really helpful when you do. No one fucking knows. They've probably been happening since the late 60s, early 70s, we think. Probably longer though. It's speculated that they started in the San Diego area and then spread out from there. However, allegedly, it wasn't until they hit Chicago and Mr. Gold Coast was started that they became more formalized. Maybe, at least that's the popular narrative. Again, no one can know for sure. We do need to talk about a man I've mentioned once or twice in this video already, a man named Chuck Renslow, which, if you know who he is, I imagine your butthole possibly just went. Chuck Renslow died in 2017 and remains to be a highly controversial figure in the world of fetish to this day. So in doing research for this video, I read his biography. I actually interviewed a few friends that knew him in person, some who liked him and some who didn't like him for his alleged actions. But the common thread through all these interviews is, regardless of people's personal feelings on him, is that he did a lot for the community, including the creation of the leather archives. We just wouldn't be the same without his existence. So while I could sit here and say, let's go and Twitter cancel a man who's been dead for 5 years via use of a Ouija board, I'd rather focus on Chuck Renslow as a brand and talk about what he did for the scene. And if you do want to find out his controversies, if you're active on the scene, it's really not that difficult to find out. And if you're not active on the scene, or quite frankly, it's not relevant to you, sweaty. So let me set the scene. It's 1958. Chuck Renslow's male physique photography studio had been raided earlier in the year because they were taking pictures of naked people. When the police raided the studio, not only did they find nudes, they found drawings of naked men by Etienne. It was a major scandal. He was dubbed the porn king of Chicago. He had his photography license revoked, although according to his biography, he just kept taking pictures anyway. That same year, Chuck Renslow and a few of his friends started meeting with other Leathermen in their leather gear, and they started hopping from bar to bar. Networking back then was really difficult. There was a phone network Renslow had created that you could call if you were in town. You could be like, hey, I'm into leather and I want some rough sex. But it wasn't ideal because you didn't know who you were gonna meet with, so there was no way to screen people. So they basically just kind of started going to bars and called it their home bar. And the group kept growing and growing. And they would either be kicked out for looking intimidating because, you know, a large group of men in leather wearing biker caps, shit's intimidating, or the bar would be shut down. Eventually, there was a bar called the Gold Coast Show Lounge that welcomed them with open arms because they were its only business. And then when the owner died, the bar was sold to Renslow and two of his peers. By 1960, the Gold Coast as we knew it opened its doors. Murals of men in leather were painted all over the walls. But they made sure to include one or two women because if the police asked, it was a biker bar. It wasn't about sucking dick and cock. But painting those murals directly on the walls was a major mistake because eventually the bar was sold again and those murals were lost. But going back to Renslow, he worked as a photographer. So he worked really closely alongside the male physique contests, you know, Mr. Chicago, Mr. Illinois, and so on. In 1972, he had the idea of running his own sort of male physique contest, but theming it around leather. And that's how Mr. Gold Coast was born. And John Lennon became the first known leather title holder. Obviously, if you were a leather title holder before 1972, please step forward, but also maybe please don't because it would ruin this part of the video. But like, it would be good for records in our community, but like really bad for my ego. This is a lot of work. Like, please just do what feels morally right to you, but love me. But these leather contests in the early days were fucking wild. First of all, it was rarely locals entering. It was guys from all over the Midwest area. They would bring dildos on the stage, subs in chains, walking on their hands and knees, and it would be a full performance. The contest grew so rapidly, it was the contest to enter. And eventually, it grew so big they could no longer do it at the Gold Coast. So they changed venue and called it International Mr. Leather. But over the 70s, as the Gold Coast grew, so did other contests internationally. As a bar owner, if you hear the concept of a contest was bringing so many people to your bar that people were literally spilling out of the door, you're gonna want a piece of that. But these days, outside of a few really well-acclaimed events, leather competitions just aren't that big of a deal anymore. A lot of younger people just have no interest in them, and the exact reason behind this is hard to say for sure. But because of this, while title holders are still respected, the actual act of competing isn't exactly held in the same light. But another form of pageantry that's very prevalent at the moment is online pageantry. gaining a following on twitter.com. I don't know, making YouTube videos like some kind of fucking freak. I personally view this as a less legitimate way of achieving status in our community. But if we go back to the old days of Tumblr, I used to follow quite a few Kinksters back then, and I've gotten to meet a few of them. And my idea of who they were versus who they actually are two very different things. I've had to kind of tear apart my experience with their Tumblr persona to actually get to know who they really are. And that's why I kind of think online pageantry is invalid, because once you leave the internet, it ceases to exist. Who do you represent if the persona that you have only exists as far as Twitter? Because the leather community is here in the physical plane. But I do think there is nuance in this. Like, if you have a following online, for example, and that following comes not just from posting sexy pictures, but also having a knowledge of the community and a connection to the community, I think that's fair. But I think we also have to recognize that is still a persona to a degree. I've been doing YouTube for 9 years this year, 8 years professionally. And when I tell you every YouTuber, and I mean every YouTuber, has an online persona, I'm not exaggerating. If they say they don't have an online persona, they're either not self-aware or they're lying. And this applies for kink profiles too. The larger the following, the more there is a need for this online persona. And I don't think this comes out of malice. I don't think people are being evil. I think it's an act of self-defense. My persona is still me. It's just a curated version of me. It's what I choose to show the world in a curated and controlled setting. I'm not gonna put the version of me on the internet at 6 in the morning having a drunk wank to some hypnosis yowie or some shit. I'm gonna let my friends record that and put it on my OnlyFans like a good friend would. There is a positive to having a large following though. When our community needs to get a message out and reach people that are not necessarily in our community, those with a large following are the heavy hitters. They can make us heard. This is all vanity. Like, it is a tool that comes from vanity, but ultimately vanity isn't inherently evil. In a lot of instances, we call vanity self-love. When I first got onto the fetish scene, I grew a following stupid fast, to the point that I made the conscious decision to take most of 2021 off of posting rubber pictures. People were coming to me asking me about events that I'd never been to, and I was like, I don't know, I can't help you. I went to my first real event in the middle of a COVID pandemic. I wasn't the representation they were looking for, and I spoke to a couple of friends that had really large online followings, and they were like, yeah, we ignore those messages because we are not the representation they are looking for. Those people and I will forward people onto local title holders, because local title holders are down to help people on the scene. It's kind of their job and their responsibility. It is not someone's job to fill the role of local title holder just because they have an online following. With that said, I will do what I can when I can. But in the Leatherman's Handbook, it talks about how leather seems to be more popular in the over 35 demographic. So this raises the question, why is this? And leather is in a decline these days. So this brings us on to chapter 4. What's next? Honestly, I don't think trying to predict what the next thing for the scene is entirely relevant. This is a scene that lives in the now and the past in equal measure. That doesn't leave much room for the future. With this said, leather competitions are on a decline, and there are less and less leather-dedicated fetish spaces. There are more and more rubber and pop events attracting a younger crowd, so what could change to attract that crowd to leather? Well, speaking from my own experience, I do know it was being around Leathermen that made me realize I was attracted to leather, so maybe some kind of leather-dedicated invasion event could be necessary. Now, if you don't know, an invasion event is basically where a bunch of kinksters will go to a bar that is typically not a kink bar, in full gear, and they'll just have a good time that evening. And it's usually done with the bar's approval as well. So there's a bar in Chicago called Sidetrack, and every Monday they do Show Tune Mondays. Well, occasionally they do Gear Tunes, which is where a bunch of kinksters turn up in fetish gear, and it's the same event but just with fetish gear. And it's so much fun. Ultimately though, it is a vanilla bar, so you can't get too hands-on. You know, someone who was featured in this video might have got in trouble at Gear Tunes for having a little bit too much fun. I also think it's by having these kind of events that, number one, it will get younger people involved with kinks they wouldn't normally consider. I think the main thing that I like about this idea is that it will allow the younger and older generations to mingle in an environment where sex is not necessarily on the table right now. And also, I just want to throw out there, it might get some of the younger guys to realize, hey, playing with older guys in the scene is a lot of fun. There is something to be said about 20 years of experience in BDSM versus 5. But where does this decline come from to begin with? Well, there isn't a simple answer. Obviously, you have to acknowledge the fact that the price of everything is going up and people's income is distinctly not going up. So that just makes leather harder to get into to begin with. And I know a lot of people feel like they need a full fetish outfit to even begin to grace an event. And a pup hood and a harness or a rubber suit is much, much cheaper than a leather uniform. But I will say, anyone that gatekeeps because they perceive a person to not have enough gear is a shit gibbon. Unless a club or a space calls for a specific type of dress code, there is no right amount of gear to have. Just show that you're trying. A leather jockstrap and a harness might be more than enough. Even the Gold Coast accepted just a pair of leather boots, which I also accept and want in my mouth now. But I do think this idea of needing a certain level of gear, needing to look your best, comes from fantasies created by social media. If you look at my rubber dupe profile, it literally looks like I came out of the gate with this closet just full of gear, when actually it was made over a relatively long period of time. And the same goes for every kinkster. No one comes out of the gate with a full closet of gear. But if you do have the power to spontaneously manifest gear, please reach out to me. I have questions. So one company I do think is doing a great job of bringing younger people to leather is Mr. RIEGILLIO. They actually make leather fairly affordable, which is one of my favorite things about them. Like, you can get a full leather shirt for close to 100 euros. That's insanely cheap. When I reached out to them because I was making this video, they actually suggested to me to use some of their designs that are made with younger people in mind. They do joggers, t-shirts, overalls, you name it, they do it in a range of colors. And what I like about it is that it shows the same fetish, leather, in a different light. It shows a different approach. I declined this because my own fetish with leather is very much tied with the history of the scene. So I really like the traditional biker look, but I still like these designs too, and will probably be purchasing a full closet of it one day, particularly if Gear Manifestation Man reaches out. Please do check them out. They make leather ridiculously affordable, and also they're huge supporters of this channel and me. They've been very patient with this video, seriously. It's been over a year. This video originally started as a video about Tom of Finland, and then it became this. Research will do that to you. Don't read books. If some change doesn't happen, do I think that this could be the last gasp of air for the leather scene, the father of the LGBTQ+ community? No. No, I don't. Things change. Everything does. What's up one minute will be down the next. The leather scene will adapt. It will have a resurgence. When that will happen, I do not know, but I'm looking forward to witnessing it and hopefully being a part of it. You know, circuit parties, they had a decline in the 2000s, then a resurgence in the 2010s. And by the way, I do think circuit parties are trash, but now there's a specific brand of gay influencer who owns about 500 Speedos and goes to, give or take, 700 circuit parties a year. It's sort of like the queer version of a straight influencer going to Dubai. Well, I don't think leather culture is necessarily fully compatible with influencer culture. I do think a resurgence will happen. So what did we learn today, my fair degenerates? Number 1, the gay leather scene was created due to men returning from World War II, the formation of motorcycle clubs, and then the eventual formation of leather bars, which allowed for BDSM experimentation and thinking. 2, old guard isn't real, but also is real. Have conversations about that because it really depends on who you talk to. Personally, I approach it from the standpoint of it's not real. 3, contests were started as a result of the scene rejecting hierarchy. And as a result, they couldn't select a leader. 4, I'm horny. 5, leather may be on a decline, but that is not going to last forever. 6, I just said I was horny. Roll the fucking credits. Hi, so I didn't know where else to put this in this video, so it's here in the credits, but I wanted to show all of you this. This is in the Leather Archives and Museum, which again, I'm very thankful for them letting me use it, and it's called A Room of Her Own, and it's about the lesbian leather scene. And obviously this video has been heavily focused on the gay men's scene, but the lesbian scene does exist. I am not nearly educated enough to speak on it, but I love this exhibit. It's a permanent exhibit, so if you're ever in the Midwest or you're passing through Chicago, please come and see this because it is fantastic. You can learn so much from not just this area of the archives, but the archives as a whole. And like, This is probably one of my favorite areas in the archives because it's curated so well. So please come and check this out.
She felt her right here, wrapped in ecstasy. Ego melts away here, trapped to say